Hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. My guest today is Brandon Kazen-Maddox, co-founder of Up Until Now Collective, an advocate for the deaf community, and a sign language artist. Brandon, thanks so much for being with us today. And I do want to say that Kathleen Taylor, a certified ASL interpreter and deafness consultant, will be interpreting for me during this conversation. Thank you both so much for being here. Brandon, you are the grandchild. I'm starting right there because I have grandchildren. I am fascinated by this. The grandchild of deaf grandparents on one side of your family. If you could tell us about that, and grew up in a household of 7 people where sign language was used or still is used.
Thank you, Carol. That is a perfect explanation of the beginnings of my life and my identity. So yes, I am a grandchild of deaf adults, or a GODA, that's a sign for it, 3rd generation heritage signer, which means that my first language is American Sign Language. And I developed skills in this visual gestural language before spoken language. And I used ASL and still use it because it was a necessity in my home. 2 deaf white grandparents and my mom and my aunts and uncle, who are all CODAs, which means children of deaf adults, CODA. And their first language is ASL as well.
That is terrific. And I think the first thing that I said to you two when we met was, I don't have my hearing aids in, so speak loudly.
That's right. And now you can just really, and does it feel like you can really understand what I'm saying when I use my hands and my voice at the same time?
Yes. I mean, it's an incredible, and as we have said, that it's because Kathleen is interpreting for me, there may be a pause between my stopping to speak and Kathleen finishing the interpretation for us.
That is right, and I think that's another reason why we have Kathleen, our interpreter, here today, is to model best practices in accessibility. We also have subtitles that are on our program so that deaf people who are watching can see your expression and see my expression and never feel like they're missing anything.
Right. I wanted to just put the numbers out there. Probably we're at like 11 million people in America who are deaf. Mm-hmm. And deaf is the proper description. Go through the things that people often think that they're being polite when they say hard of hearing or hearing impaired, and that's not polite. In fact, that's not the proper way to address deaf people.
That's right, Carol. Yes. So the first thing I'll say is that I don't ever speak for the deaf community. I can only speak from my own personal perspective, but being raised with deaf people and in deaf culture, I have perspective on the language and the culture, right? So in the deaf community, you have little d deaf and big D deaf. And so little d deaf means that you are audiologically deaf. That means you went to an audiologist and had a test, and they showed that your hearing has declined, or wherever it is when you were born, you are deaf, little d. But that's a medical prescription and diagnosis. And big D deaf means that you are culturally deaf, which means that you have been exposed to the deaf community, the big D deaf community. You have deaf friends or relatives, and you use American Sign Language as your primary form of communication because you need it, or it's part of your family or who you are as a person in your identity. So that's little d deaf, audiological diagnosis, big D deaf, sign language, linguistics, and culture.
And then you have the 2 groups of people who would define themselves as deaf, those who were born that way and whose first language may be sign language, and those who are becoming deaf, like perhaps me, will need to use something like the sign language if I'm gifted enough to be able to learn it and to do it.
Absolutely, yes. And so I'm really happy that you mentioned that. You know, there's a slogan in our communities, which is to sign is human. To sign is human. And I really believe that. You know, I understand that there's been many years of oppression on many communities, including deaf people. But when it comes to acquiring language, deaf people have experienced so much language deprivation. And that's a huge focus of our world, is providing language access for deaf people. And then there's also many people in the world who are not deaf, but also use sign language. You know, there's hard of hearing people who are really in the middle of this deaf world and the hearing world, and they feel stuck, and they feel ostracized, and they feel alone and isolated. And we have sign language to be able to bring everyone together. And that's why I'm here, I think.
Right, well, you're a gift to all of us because you can take us through this transition. You were a child in this family, talking with and relating to your grandparents, and tell us what that was like, how you experienced that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I was just with my family for Thanksgiving, and I brought my partner, Kevin Newberry, who is a theater and opera director and a co-founder of our company, Up Until Now Collective. And you know, he's a hearing person, but in opera has dealt with so many people who use different languages. But because of our relationship, he is high exposure to sign language. So it's so fascinating to see him in the many different ways that my family communicates, and talking and signing, and talking with my grandma, and, you know, and talking in the Black world of my Nana, because on the Black side of my family is my Nana and my auntie, who I grew up with also. So there's the village that it took to raise me is intersectional and beautiful. But to answer your question directly, I did have to interpret a lot for my grandma and grandpa growing up. We also had the TTY, which is this old machine that was like the OG text messenger, but it was huge. You had to put your phone on it, and it made all these noises. And that was how, you know, school would communicate with my grandma and grandpa, that they had to come and pick me up. You know, my grandparents worked at the post office, so take your child to work day was, hey, take your grandchild to work day and look at the post office and meet my deaf friends, you know? So that was a huge part of my growing up. But interpreting, facilitating, taking phone calls from, you know, the bank or the doctor, or, you know, the same kinds of things that CODAs have to do, but as a third generation signer who lives with your family who's deaf is also what a GODA did.
Right, so again, CODA is child of a deaf person.
Yes.
GODA is grandchild. Now, I'm told that you had an experience with your grandmother that was somewhat definitive in your life. Talk to us about that.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, you know, growing up, I would drive with my grandparents, and when deaf people are driving, and of course deaf people can drive, but signing and driving takes a lot of, you know, coordination. Your eyes really have to work on the road, and they got to work on who you're talking to. And driving one-handed, I'm really good at, and driving with my knees so I can talk is really a part of my life too. But, you know, when I turned 15 and a half, I got my permit to drive in Vancouver, Washington. And so my grandma and I were driving, and we were leaving the mall, and it was nighttime, and we had to turn the dome light on because we need to be able to see each other's hands and our faces for sign language. And so we get on the highway, and I turn the dome light on. It's very deaf culture to do it. If the dome light is not on, then you're relying on the moon and any street lights who are going by. And in like rural Vancouver, Washington, it was street light, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So dome light goes on, we're talking, all of a sudden, rearview mirror, red and blue. I'm like, oh man, I'm 15 and a half. What are you saying? Pull over. Of course, there's a lot of racism where I'm from, and I have a white deaf woman in my car, and I'm a black kid who probably is looked at as an adult. So who knows how this is going to go?
Sure,
Right?
sure.
So it's a white cop, my first time being pulled over myself. So that was very nerve-wracking because I had to stay, calm and listen to my mom's voice in my head saying, keep your hands on the wheel, don't put your hands in your pockets, call the officer sir.
The black sun advice, right?
The black
the Bible,
sun
so that you
advice.
don't get shot.
I'm saying, and you think about, and I did have to move my hands, but I had to fight my own instinct I had to talk to him, but then my grandma was like, what's going on?
Right,
So there's
right.
this whole exchange of me having to explain that my grandma is deaf and I need to use my hands to sign. And whether or not that man believes me is up to him, right? And so that's my own perspective, but deaf people, especially a black deaf man or woman or trans person driving, that is something that they have to understand as a part of their experience.
And certainly deaf people have been killed because either police or interaction with the community at large have not understood that they were deaf.
That is correct. Another aspect of getting arrested or handcuffed is with deaf people, you're supposed to handcuff them in the front of their body. With hearing people, you handcuff behind. However, that's literally like taking tape and putting it over our mouths, right? And also if you're read the Miranda rights vocally, but you don't hear them, then did you really receive them?
Right, precisely. So describe American Sign Language to us, because there is Black Sign Language, there is Native American Sign Language, and of course people sign in different, French, Spanish, whatever. But let's deal with American Sign Language first. How was this developed, and how does everybody know that they're speaking the same language, sign language?
What a fun question. So I'll start with the fact that it's different to be born into a culture where a language is used, let's say Spanish, for example, and then to become an interpreter. And then the responsibilities that you have when you become an interpreter. So I became an interpreter when I started this journey about 12 years ago. And before I started interpreting, I was an ASL artist, as I am now, right? But an artist who dances and does acrobatics, right? I did a performance and the deaf community saw me and said, oh my gosh, your sign language is so beautiful, you should become an interpreter professionally. And I was like, huh. So I read a book. Because they gave me a book. So you want to be an interpreter. I was like, okay. And that was the beginning of my journey. But I immediately understood that when you become an interpreter, you have many responsibilities, right? Your responsibility is to facilitate communication between deaf and hearing people. In sign language, we have different registers, right? We have simultaneous communication, where we talk and sign at the same time. We have Pidgin signed English, which is a mixture of English and sign language. We have also C sign, which is signing every almost syllable. And these are older kinds of sign language. Then you have ASL, American Sign Language, right? And the history behind that goes back to France. And basically there is a monk who, there are two men, Laurent Clerc, who's a French man, and Thomas Gallaudet, who's an American man. And if we know about Gallaudet University,
yes,
that's who it's named after.
Right.
So there was a visit to France, and understanding that this man named Abbé du Épée, he was working with French deaf children and using French Sign Language, developing a system of hand gestures, and that is where our American Sign Language comes from. It was brought to here and established at American School for the Deaf in 1817, and that's really the birth of deaf culture, was where the first time that we were using American Sign Language linguistics and had deaf community to use it together, and it was being taught, the language and education was being taught in sign language.
It's fascinating. And now there is this whole, I guess, a professor at Boston University, my old school, who was concerned that Black Sign Language is being lost. What's that like?
So BASL, Black American Sign Language, is a fascinating aspect of our American history. And it comes from segregation. It comes from our own racist, oppressive past. And heritage as Americans. And it's because, of course, we had Black schools and white schools because of our segregation, but we also had Black deaf schools and white deaf schools. And as you can't have language without culture and linguistics. And if your culture is all Black or all white, then your linguistics will also evolve as such. And interestingly enough, my grandma went to an integrated deaf school. So I learned signs that were both traditional ASL, I would never call it white ASL, and Black ASL. And there are aspects of Black ASL like signing two-handed, signing larger, using more signing space, bigger facial expressions, and there are other choices in. We have two words for dialect. We have dialect with your voice, and dialect with your hands. And dialect meaning your sign choices are distinct and unique, related to your region and your culture where you grew up.
So Brandon, tell us the difference between an ASL interpreter, performer, and artist.
Absolutely, yes. So I like to kind of draw the ideas in three distinctions. The first being an ASL interpreter. That's and an ASL interpreter's job is to solely facilitate communication between the deaf community and hearing people. An interpreter is not only for deaf people, it's for hearing people too, right? And an interpreter can be deaf and they can be hearing. And also their identity is supposed to be only that of an interpreter. So they are not to have an opinion or express their emotions behind what they're interpreting. They're supposed to stay neutral and kind of remain a shadow because they're only a vessel and taking on other people's opinions and language, which I did for 12 years professionally, which is fine.
Right.
And I loved it.
It's like being a news reporter, right? You're just a reporter.
Yes, just the facts, ma'am. You know, that. And then you have an ASL performer. These people can be deaf or hearing also. However, the deaf community is really motivated to see deaf people on stage signing music or doing performances or being in shows like on Broadway. We have the show right now, Our Town, which our friend John McGinty's on that. He's in that show as a deaf performer, right? Which is amazing. In both of these distinctions, you can and should have a director of artistic sign language, which means a deaf person whose eyes and heart and hands are on the work. Behind the camera, if there's a script, that deaf person can look at the script and talk to the producers or talk to the director and say, this works for the deaf community, or like, maybe consider this, right? So it's just, it's another perspective and it's a deaf perspective and it's important. What I do is I'm an ASL artist, which means that as you know, I grew up with this language and deaf people are a part of who I am as a person. And I talk and sign because it's part of my voice, period.
And it's beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. If people ask me to not sign, it's like taking away half of my voice.
Sure.
Or if people were to ask me to only sign, I could do that, But what I do is I work with deaf and hearing and hard of hearing and deaf blind and blind people, all people, to create art that deaf and hearing people can share and enjoy together. And I always pull in a deaf director of artistic sign language, a DAZZLE, to have their eyes, their heart, and their hands on my work to make sure that everything feels and looks as strong as it can for all communities.
Right. Well, you're wonderful to look at. I tell you. You know this. So now you were telling me that you were in the circus as a performer. Is that? Talk to us about that experience.
Yeah, definitely. So before I became an interpreter, I was in the circus, right? So I grew up as a gymnast from age 4 to 10. And because my grandparents worked at the post office, they paid for my gymnastics lessons. So the deafness is all up in here. But always having, acrobatics and back handsprings. I don't remember learning a back handspring. I've just always been able to do it. Just like signing. And then I, studied dance and then was in the circus for 7 years in San Francisco. It was a fun way to spend my 20s, a wild time of artistry and makeup and costumes and expression and sign language and dance. And that's where my ASL artistry really bloomed. And I started taking music and dance and sign language and merging it into real performance. And I would see things on Broadway when I would come to New York and see sign language in things. But I was like, it's not really what I want to see. I would see dance, but I'm like, there's no sign language. I would see performances, but I'm like, there could be more. And so when you don't have what you envision, you have to make it.
Well, Rihanna had a signer at her performance. Was that at the Super Bowl? And the signer became a superstar. Yeah. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So her name is Justina Miles, and she is amazing. We can see here. And part of the reason why she's so dope is because you see representation, right? You see Rihanna and you see Justina, and you can see that their spirits there's things in common, right? She's not afraid to have the nails or the bracelets or the makeup or the earrings, which kind of distinguishes her from an interpreter to a performer, right? And I'm not sure if they had directors of artistic sign language on their team. Justina Miles is self-identified as a deaf woman, so it's up to her if she wanted to have a DAZZLE or not. And her sign choices are really strong, and her musicality is strong too, and that's why people really gravitated to her.
Well, Brandon, talk to us about acceptance of deaf people, acceptance of sign language, more people learning sign language to be able to speak directly to the deaf.
Definitely, and I love that you say speak directly, because if we can imagine a world where everyone knew sign language, deaf people would have more autonomy. They would have more empowerment because they could communicate directly with the people who want to work with them. Right now, we need interpreters. And that's why we also have deaf interpreters, so that you have a deaf perspective. But if you can imagine a world where we all knew sign language, and that would require that we teach it early in school, which is possible. It's the third most popular language in the United States.
And so we should teach it to kindergartners.
Absolutely, we should teach it to kindergartners through your senior year of high school. I mean, imagine how many more job opportunities would be for deaf people if your teacher was deaf, or if you had to have that many deaf teachers teaching the youth sign language.
Well, I love it. I'm all for it. And I know that you've got a special coming up on PBS.
I do. So it's on the All Arts channel on PBS, which just went national, which is really exciting. They have their streaming network, they have their Instagram, they have their YouTube, and they've got their website. And so it's a half an hour episode that features our work with Up Until Now Collective and sign language and mermaids, just as a little preview.
Right, right. And, you know, Audra has been raving about your appearance in Times Square. I missed that, but what was it?
Yes, yes. And so what you'll see right here
Right.
is the Midnight Moment. And that was on 85 screens in Times Square in 2021, as you see. And that's Mervyn Primo O'Brien, Mervyn, who's a deaf performer and artist. And we took Gladys Knight and the Pips' Midnight Train to Georgia. Both of us together, we made an ASL music video with our series called Soul Signs. And we honored 5 Black singers and female singers and translated all 5 of their songs into American Sign Language. And that one made it on 85 screens in Times Square for a month in July. So it was really exciting.
That is great. Quickly tell us how people can get in touch with you, your website from your organization.
Yeah, definitely. So again, our organization is called Up Until Now Collective. Up Until Now Collective. You can find us on Instagram with that same Up Until Now Collective. And then our website is the same. And if you want to get a hold of me directly, you can find me on Instagram at Kazen-Maddox and my own personal website, but you can find everything through Up Until Now Collective.
Well, you both are fantastic. You know, Brandon Kazen-Maddox, thank you, and Kathleen. I'm sorry, the next time we will get your backstory. It's very, very interesting about that. But Brandon, thank you both very much for coming to talk with us about American Sign Language and about talking directly to the deaf. We appreciate it so much.
Carol, thank you so much, and thank you all here at Black America, and thank you to our interpreter, Kathleen Taylor, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And that's it for us at this time. We thank you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. The next time I'm going to know the sign language for that, I promise. Thank you both very much. And now you can download the CUNY TV app in your Apple Store or in Google Play and find us there.